Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a Bookstore Q&A. I'm Dr. Matthew Westerholm, and it is my privilege today to interview Dr. Daniel Stevens.
Hello, and I'm really grateful you're all here. Pleasant surprise.
Yeah, wonderful to see a good group of people here. I'm professor of worship and church music here at the school, and I see only 3 people from my program here. So it is clear I have not given out enough extra credit to my students. I will increase that for next time. Lesson learned. Thank you, Anna Libby, faithful Anna Libby. It is my privilege today. We are highlighting not just Dr. Stevens in general, but we are highlighting this wonderful new book, Songs of the Sun. Reading the Psalms with the author of Hebrews, a wonderful new book that Dr. Stevens has written. When I found out you were writing this, I contacted you and told you how interested the topic was, and you were kind enough to send me a bit of a pre-publication version of this.
Yeah, I was thrilled that anyone wanted to read my work, so I sent that right away.
It appears I am not alone. And you sent me a pre-publication PDF of this, which I devoured quickly. And so when you reached out to ask me to talk about this, I've been very glad to. It's been hard not to contact you with a bunch of other questions. Instead, I printed them all up here. Inspired by the Kriegel series, 40 Questions, Dr. Plummer's book, 40 Questions for Interpreting the New Testament, I have generated 40 questions of my own. I will not go through all of them. We'll pick and choose from here. But I thought maybe a good way, I'm sure many people here are already familiar with you, Dr. Stevens, and some of your background, but I thought it might be a good way to sort of open our conversation talking about your biography, kind of your journey in faith, and perhaps it lands somewhere on your first encountering with Psalms and Hebrews, but if not, just whatever the Lord brings to mind.
Gladly. So hi, I am Daniel Stevens. I am the assistant professor of New Testament interpretation for Boyce College, so I teach most of the New Testament classes for the undergrads here. I became a Christian in high school. I actually just remembered this last week that when I was a senior in high school, so shortly after becoming a Christian, someone who was discipling me was preaching through Hebrews. And so we ended up using that as our study. So from the beginning, it's been with me essentially. I then studied classical Greek in my undergraduate because I initially was a biology major and did not like chemistry and was procrastinating by reading Greek. So I figured I should just make a go of it. I then did my MDiv at the Master's Seminary, and then did my PhD in New Testament at the University of Cambridge, where at this point, predictably, I focused on the Epistle to the Hebrews. And I got into my project there by having taught through Hebrews in adult Sunday school at my church while I was going through seminary. And I noticed a distinction in how promise language and covenant language was used there. And I was like, hey, did anyone look into this? And the answer was no. And so I looked into it, and that was my dissertation. Then came from there to work at the Museum of the Bible for 3 years, which is where I met my wife, who was in the back of the room with our kids, and then came here after working there for a little while, and now I'm glad to teach. So I got into the academic study of Hebrews through teaching through it in a church and just having all sorts of questions about what seemed to be the intricacies and the complexity of the book that I just have loved following and tracing since then.
Yeah, wonderful. Not a spoiler alert, but I think part of the argument of the book is that Hebrews helps us read the Psalms.
Yes, exactly.
If I could say it in a quick, brief sentence, Hebrews, our knowledge of what the author of the book of Hebrews, that's a follow-up question, who wrote it. But that the author of the book of Hebrews was an excellent reader and interpreter of the Psalms. So maybe a little bit, we've heard some of your background in Hebrews. What about some of your experience in first coming to the Psalms?
Right. So there, very little kind of my specialized training is in the Psalms, but as a Christian, I've been exposed to them for quite a bit now, and seeing kind of increasing uses of the Psalms in worship, I've seen as an encouraging thing. It's helped me. Even kind of something like albums of Psalms for worship have been great comforts to me. So being used to them and wanting to get the text of them kind of in my heart has been an ongoing project of mine. But then Hebrews, again, is the culprit here. As I was trying to not only understand the argument that Hebrews makes, but specifically the ways in which Hebrews interprets the Old Testament and builds its argument, that drives me back to the Psalms, because one of the main sources of theology and of Christology that Hebrews goes to is the Psalter. And once I started seeing that, I thought, well, this isn't limited to Hebrews. So in Acts chapter 2 with Peter's first sermon, and then in Acts chapter 13 with Paul's first sermon, where do they go to talk about Jesus? They go to the Psalms. And then in Jesus' own earthly ministry, where does he often go to talk about himself and also to stump those who don't believe in him? It's the Psalms. So the New Testament as a whole kept driving me back there. And at first, like when I first started noticing this, it was like, oh, aren't these interesting readings? But okay, that's what the New Testament does. But the more that I saw it, the more I thought there's actually a consistent method of reading that's going on here that is not putting things onto the Psalms, it's taking things out of them.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think many people, especially from my field of study in church music, view the Psalms primarily as emotional, poetic, artistry, musical, and not really theological. They would say that it's more issues of the heart, and that like Romans is issues of the head and theology. But you see the Psalms as profoundly theological.
Yes, deeply so. And I think the whole New Testament leads us to see it that way. That while, yes, we do find words for emotions, yes, we do find words for experiences of life within the Psalms, we also have words about Jesus, and as Hebrews points to see, words that are put into the mouth of Jesus. And so we see not just ourselves there, but we see in various ways the story of the life of Christ and the ministry that he has.
Maybe that's a good thing to follow up on. The subtitle is, the title is Songs of the Son. In what way do you see the Psalms as Christ's songs?
Yes. I am an academic, so I overthought this title. And the of there is meant in two senses. So of number one, it's the songs that are about Jesus. So he is their subject matter. They are songs that sing about him. But then also in following the lead of Hebrews, they're his songs that he sings them, or at least some of them, that they're in Hebrew citation practices, they're put into his mouth. And so we're invited to see him speaking them to the Father or in our midst or on our behalf.
Yeah, excellent. One of the things that each of your chapters kind of chooses a psalm and works through it, and the chapters are wonderfully coordinated by using an identical method in each way. You talk about reading the Psalms twice. Could you kind of explain what that means and how that kind of shapes each of these chapters?
Absolutely. So in each chapter, it's aimed at reading the psalm, which is first straightforward. Reading the psalm, I go through it in order from beginning to end, and I try to draw out what are the main themes of the psalm, what are the thrusts, but then also what questions does the psalm leave us with? So say with Psalm 2, who is this king who is enthroned in Zion, but who is also called the Son of God, and depending on how a nation relates to him, it either rises or falls. In Psalm 45, who is this very clearly human king who is about to get married, but is also called God with an eternal throne? So the questions that the psalm itself raises, and I don't answer them yet. I just raise them and note the themes of the psalm, note the main thrust of it. Then I go to Hebrews, where Hebrews cites each of these psalms. That's the selection criteria. I only use psalms that Hebrews cited. And I see anywhere from 1 to 4 verses that Hebrews cites. What does Hebrews say about the psalm, and what interpretive angle does it bring? Then I read the psalm again, taking the lens that Hebrews provides, and ask what happens if we read the whole psalm in the way that Hebrews did. And what we find is the questions and tensions raised by the initial reading of the psalm are answered and resolved by the lens that Hebrews brings.
It is so good. Would you mind like picking one of the psalms? Like you don't need to read a chapter in your book, but would you mind just like picking? Is there one that would be kind of the easiest to demonstrate that with?
So I just alluded to two, so Psalm 2 and Psalm 45, answering those who is it questions. For maybe slightly less straightforward psalm, we have Psalm 8, which is first and foremost about humanity. So it begins with, "O Lord, how majestic is your name over all the earth." The heavens declaring his glory. Then the meditation on man, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him. And then it discusses the kind of dominion of man over nature. So it goes through the things created in Genesis 1 and how God has elevated mankind over the angels and to have all of those things under our dominion. The tension in the psalm that Hebrews brings out isn't that it's immediately just about Jesus. It's about humanity properly, but the universal human experience after the fall is that these things aren't under our control, that the world is not as it should be. These things don't submit to man. And so Hebrews explicitly asks, nothing was left outside of his control, so what do we do with this? And the solution that Hebrews puts forward is that Jesus, as the representative human, lives the perfect life, dies, but then rises and ascends, and all things are under his control as he's now ascended and seated in heaven. So Hebrews is able to both say, we don't yet see all things under man's control, but we see him, the exalted man who is over all things now. And so the tension in the psalm is not resolved by kind of pushing it away or saying, oh, this is, eventually we're going to get it. But it's like, no, it's true of Jesus now. And because in the language of Hebrews, he's our forerunner, it will be true of us. We're sure of that because it's his now. So we're able to see how Psalm 8 truly does speak of us, even in a post-fall world, by speaking of him.
Yeah, so Psalm 8, Hebrews sees both Adam, humanity, and Christ as a second Adam.
Yes, yeah, as the representative man. Yeah.
So excellent. And chapter after chapter after chapter, it keeps coming. It's so excellent. I was going to ask another question that was, I think you've already sort of answered, about how does rereading help us see Jesus in the Psalms? Would you describe some of your interpretation? Is it typology? Is it prophetic? How would you describe your way of reading this?
Right. One of the things that I was surprised by in going through this book is that it isn't all one thing. It's not all just typology, because sometimes it's not that it's about a human figure first and then about Jesus, but sometimes it's directly prophetic. So sometimes it's directly about Jesus. Other times there's a theological move that we get largely from Augustine, so it's known as kind of totus Christus, the whole of Christ. In the beginning of Augustine's expositions on the Psalms, so in Psalm 1, he says that the first question that we're supposed to ask when we come to a psalm is, in what manner is Christ speaking, either in respect to his own proper person as the head or in respect to his body, the church. Sometimes it was that Christ is kind of speaking for us. Sometimes it is about a human figure, and then kind of the greater David, it's about him, and then other times it's more direct. So we get multiple lanes of getting to Jesus. It's not all one thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Just in case you thought there wouldn't be enough content with the Psalms and Hebrews, Augustine has entered the chat. Perhaps
frequent dialogue partner.
Yeah. Oh, such good news. How about in your book, you kind of mention a couple other classic treatments of the Psalms in particular, and maybe just some comments on things you found helpful or less helpful in some of those.
Yeah. So the three kind of consistent historical sources I was looking to make sure that my readings were at least not crazy by historical standards were Augustine, Calvin, and Spurgeon. So long extended treatments of the Psalms each time. Also all available in the public domain if you want to go read them.
Or the bookstore.
For a nice bound copy. So each of them are convinced that Christ is in the Psalms, but each of them read that in different ways. So Augustine leaned heavily on that the whole of Christ, either the head or the body, is there. Calvin was more historicizing, so often through typologies, he'll get this, he'll say, how is this first about David or Solomon and then about Jesus? Whereas Spurgeon was kind of a mix of those, and so bouncing back and forth. Like on Psalm, I think it's 40, his first line is, evidently Christ is here. So it's just immediate. And so they had different ways that kind of balanced each other and that were just fruitful and encouraging people to think with.
Yeah. Obviously, your book sort of zeroes in specifically on the Psalms that the book of Hebrews works in. Otherwise, who knows how long the book would be? It's a great limiting factor there. Do you see in your reading, has that given you lenses to see Christ in other Psalms besides the ones that the author of Hebrews, let's say Barnabas?
Okay, Tertullian.
Yeah. Does that give you lenses to see Christ in other passages?
Yeah, I think so, and I think I've increasingly seen a consistent way of reading the Psalms across the New Testament, which has led me into that as well. For example, I was just preaching through a part of Ephesians. There's a what was previously a somewhat perplexing citation to me in Ephesians chapter 4 when it talks about how God has given various gifts to the people in the church. And then he cites a psalm. When he ascended on high, he took captivity captive and gave gifts to men. And it seems like it comes out of left field. Yeah. He doesn't even really need the psalm citation to prove his point, because in 1 Corinthians, when he talks about the same thing, he doesn't go there. So why reference the psalm? And then somewhat even weirder on first reading, Paul then goes on in Ephesians to talk about focusing in on just that word ascended. So not even the gift-giving part, but what does it mean by ascended, except that he had also descended to the lower regions, that is the earth. Okay, where is he getting that in the psalm? So if we go to the psalm itself, it's a psalm that speaks of the salvation of the Lord. I'm going to forget the number. I know it has a 4 and a 6 in it. It's either 64 or 46, something like that. I'm bad at chapter numbers, actually. It begins by declaring and God's past acts of salvation and praising him for it. Starts with the Exodus, then the wilderness, then the conquering of kingdoms, and then it ends with then the first section ends with the foundation of the temple in Jerusalem and the phrase Sinai is in the sanctuary. Then immediately after that, he has ascended on high, taken captivity captive. And then after that, no more discussion of past deliverance, but future faith and deliverances that God is going to do. So that ascending line is clearly a shift. And even more weirdly, God doesn't usually ascend in the Old Testament. The only times he does so is after previously descending to talk to someone. And then even more weirdly, God never ascends on high. He does things from on high. He sends help from on high. He reaches down from on high. He sends rain from on high. And so that one line in the psalm is weird. And it should prompt us to ask, when did God need to ascend on high? How could this have happened? And that's why that's the line that Paul focuses on, that he ascended. Well, if he ascended, he previously had to descend to the lower regions of the earth. So Paul sees in that the earthly ministry and ascension of Jesus, and upon that ascension, he then gives gifts, which is the Holy Spirit working in the church. So Paul, using that line from that psalm, isn't arbitrary using the word gift-giving, but he's following the storyline of the life of Jesus, and he's following the storyline of the psalm, and he's saying, wait a second, what is ascension doing here? Yeah. And grabs onto that.
So excellent. So excellent. How about sort of all of the truths are so glorious and so wonderful. Maybe a practical question. How would you encourage pastors who might be preaching through Hebrews or through the Psalms to maybe to benefit from the book or from some of the studies, and then perhaps individual Christians who are just working their way through Hebrews or the Psalms? Would be some practical help.
Step 1, read the book. But more seriously, so for preaching the Psalms or preaching Hebrews and getting to the parts where the Psalms are there, first, the New Testament reading of the Old in general, the New Testament reading of the Psalms in particular, isn't arbitrary. You don't need to be afraid that, yeah, he says this thing, but we can't really go to the Psalm and see how to back this up at all. So be confident it's not arbitrary. Instead, look for the internal logic. Second, when looking at the Psalms themselves, know that Christ is there, that there are legitimate ways of preaching the Psalms and reading the Psalms and seeing Christ and getting to him. Third, and related to that, that doesn't mean every Psalm is actually just a mask for the book of Romans. It's not that we kind of, read a psalm or preach a psalm and you get 80% of the way, and then you do the Romans Road evangelistic presentation, that's doing it. But rather in, say, Psalm 2, we see the kingship of Jesus. In Psalm 8, we see the representative humanity of Jesus. In Psalm 110, we see the priesthood of Jesus. These are different aspects of what he came to do. And it's okay seeing just that part there, because that's probably the part that is there. And we don't need to feel the need to say that every Old Testament passage has the whole New Testament in it, but rather there are ways in which Christ is foreshadowed or prophesied of or speaking or spoken of.
Yeah, wonderful. What about similar then for like a Christian just working their way devotionally through the Psalms?
Yeah, so similarly, know that Jesus is there. It's a book that speaks to you, but it's not just a book about you. It's not just a book about your own emotions. Again, we do find words for emotions there, so I'm not downplaying that. I'm saying there's more, not less. And so be confident that the words of the Psalms can speak to you of God more broadly, can speak to you of the ministry of Christ. And especially, or at least for me, the parts where often I find Psalms that I don't emotionally connect to, whether that's kind of, deliver a conquering king, or kind of statements of rule or various other things, that they don't need to immediately emotionally connect to me because I'm not necessarily the character in the psalm, but rather to see who is there, what character is there, who is speaking, and see the ways in which that affects you.
Yeah, wonderful. I found one of the best parts of good psalm interpretation. You said the word character. I feel like too often I read the Psalms with main character energy. I think my kids would say. I read it as if, where am I in the Psalm? And you had a helpful phrase in the book where you talked about divine conversation in the Psalm. That as we read the Psalms, we hear language from within the Godhead.
Yeah, or, obviously, the inter-Trinitarian dialogue doesn't use human words, so it's in a way that we can understand. But where I get this from is from Hebrews. So in Hebrews chapter 1 first, where it says, he says, that is, God says, you are my son, today I've begotten you. So it says, God says, Psalm 2, and then that second person speech, so who is he saying it to? He's saying it to the Son. You are my son, today I've begotten you. And then if we go to Psalm 2, we find that is reported speech. I will tell of the decree. He said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. So it's as if the Son is letting us in on what the Father has said to the Son. And then similarly in Hebrews 2, we have the Son says, behold, I am the children God has given me. So he cites Isaiah 8. And then also, I will tell of your name in the midst of congregation. I will sing your praise, which is citing a psalm. So that's the Son speaking to the Father in our presence. And so that dialogue quality of the Father speaking to the Son, the Son speaking to the Father, and reporting the speech of the Father to us is both there in the Psalms and is reported to us in Hebrews, because Hebrews is very explicit. God says, referring to the Father. The Son says. The Holy Spirit says.
Yeah. So helpful. And such a wonderful and glorious reality that we are brought into the conversation between the persons of the Godhead, an inter-Trinitarian disclosure, which is just astounding. Maybe just a few words on 110. Psalm 110, you talked about the priesthood of Christ there. It's cited several times in the New Testament, not just by the author of Hebrews, but profoundly by the author
everywhere,
of Hebrews.
So Psalm 110, the most referred to Old Testament passage in the New Testament. Also, on first reading, one of the weirdest. So you have, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So, okay, we have a royal figure, since David is acknowledging someone as Lord. Jesus uses this to stump those who are trying to ask him questions in Jerusalem. But then it ends with, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So we have a royal figure who is also a priest, but not a Levitical priest, a Melchizedekian priest. So that takes us to Genesis and nowhere else. And so it's an enigmatic psalm, to say the least. It has these elusive references to kind of somewhat obscure Genesis characters and to this figure who is above David. And this royal priest, as we could say, is in many ways at the heart of the whole argument of Hebrews. So Hebrews 1 is more focusing on the kind of royal enthroned aspect of Jesus. The rest of Hebrews is mostly focusing on the priesthood part. The fact that there's a priest after the order of Melchizedek is what makes Jesus' priesthood legitimate, because he's not from the household of Levi. And so it's it's core to the whole argument of Hebrews, and Hebrews keeps coming back to it again and again and again. And to go back to something I said earlier, the whole notion of asking questions that the psalm demands. Well, in the context of the Old Testament, who is the king that's greater than David, that is also a priest and somehow lives forever and waits for God to make his enemies a footstool? There isn't really a character in the Old Testament by itself that is clearly the answer to that. And so it's an Old Testament question that demands a New Testament answer. And it should, if we're reading straight through, lead to that sort of an expectation.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a hard one now.
Okay.
Okay. So there are many churches I'm a worship professor, many churches who sing psalms and think that that's the right thing to do. Isaac Watts complained that if we only sing the psalms, we're not singing about Jesus. We never get to say the Savior's name in worship. And so he paraphrased the psalms. He changed Psalm 72 into Jesus shall reign where'er the sun.
Right.
He paraphrased. He paraphrased Psalm 98 into joy to the world the Lord has come, let earth receive its king. Several others where he wanted to make explicit, what do you think, how should churches in worship services use psalms? Should we sing just psalms? Should we have New Testament? How would you answer to that sort of question?
Yeah. I'm not going to argue for exclusive psalmody, but I think that there is a beneficial ambiguity when using the words of the Psalms. In the New Testament, in addition to Christ, what is the most common title of Jesus?
Son of Man?
Lord, throughout.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus calls himself Son of Man, but throughout the rest of the New Testament, and when people refer to him, Lord. And when citing Old Testament passages that, if you were reading the Hebrew, would have the Tetragrammaton, and your modern English will have kind of the small caps, they cite it in a Greek form that just uses the Greek word Lord, which creates a purposeful ambiguity. Is it talking about God in terms of the full Trinity, or is it talking about the person of Jesus in particular? And sometimes the New Testament authors will cite Old Testament passages and say, this is directly about Jesus, because it has the word Lord in it. Those who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. It's about Jesus. And so there's a kind of divinely intended purposeful ambiguity there, where Old Testament passages about the Lord can, not necessarily every one of them, but can be referred to Jesus specifically. Amen. So that's there. That matters. Even the Lord said to my Lord, and then Jesus asks, well, who's that? So we are singing about him when we sing the Psalms. We don't get to use his personal name, Jesus, if we only have psalmody. So I think there is value to bringing in other things too, but it's not as if he's not there and we're not singing about him.
Yeah. Excellent. I just again want to highlight. I want to thank Crossway would be one way to say this. I think it's easy to sell books that are very topical and kind of written for this particular moment. I am delighted to say that when I first heard about the book, I thought, surely there's another book that does something like this, and there just isn't. This is an evergreen book. This book could have been written in the 1980s and the 1890s and the 1690s, and it's so useful to us and so evergreen.
Very kind.
It's evergreen. It will also be useful in 50 years and 100 years from now.